Things That We Never Saw Coming by Brian Rowe. Chapter 1. Deborah and Sam. When Deborah was born, for reasons that she would never learn, her mother, without ever holding her newborn child even once, left the hospital and never returned. She had come into the emergency room alone one evening, already in labor, and was rushed immediately to the delivery room. After having her baby, and before filling out any paperwork to record her identity, she just disappeared. Soon afterward, the newborn baby was placed under the care of the state. 2 weeks later, the baby, now named Deborah, a name given to her by the nurse who was on duty when her mother's absence was discovered, was placed in the state-managed orphanage located near the heart of Philadelphia's harsh inner city. Newborns were typically placed in facilities nearer the suburban neighborhoods, where there was a better likelihood of them being adopted, but Deborah's case fell through the cracks in the bureaucratic system, and she would remain in the orphanage for many years to come. Hers was a unique beginning. A ward of the state from birth, she never had the experience of living with a parent in a home, so she adapted to life in the orphanage with ease. Many of the other children, having been placed there after being removed from their parents' homes for various reasons, including neglect, abandonment, and in some cases abuse, found that they had trouble adapting to their new surroundings at first. She found herself often singled out by the orphanage staff because she was considered a well-behaved child, to serve as an example for the other kids to follow. She was young and enjoyed the attention this created, making her feel special and unique. Because of these feelings, and because she was a naturally bright child who caught on to things quickly, she stood out from the other children, not only at the orphanage, but also academically at school, where she looked forward to going to every day, with enthusiasm. All in all, her early years were full of fun and good times, and despite her not having parents, she was a very happy child. It was as she got older and became more aware that Deborah began to notice little things, like when some of her classmates who lived at home with their parents came to school with new shoes, or a new coat, or even mittens that matched one another, that her outlook on life and her behavior slowly began to change. All of her clothes, for as long as she could remember, were used. It never mattered to her in her earlier years at school, but as she turned 9 years old and entered the 4th grade, the grade where students were now proudly talking about their new school clothes for the first time, Deborah felt left out of the conversation that the other kids were having. That is, until she started getting teased by them because she was wearing the same clothes from the year before. So now, despite her feeling special because of the attention she received at the orphanage and at school, she began to feel that it was because the other kids had homes with parents who loved them and bought them new clothes that they were better than she was. No one had ever said this aloud to her. Instead, she just imagined it, keeping the thoughts to herself where they grew and festered over time. Now aware of the difference between having to live at the orphanage and other kids who lived at home, she soon began to focus on the negative aspects of living there. She started to believe that the reason she had not yet been chosen by a couple was because the orphanage was purposely preventing her from being adopted because she was such a good girl and such a model orphan for the other kids to follow. Ironically, the very thing that was once the foundation of her feelings of high self-esteem was now the reason for her feelings of shame. Deborah's young mind soon became jaded, and then she just wanted to get as far away from the orphanage as she could. She became determined to find out who her mother was, convinced that she could go back to live with her mother, who would want her now because she was such a good girl. It took some time for her to plan it out, but she was patient and waited until one night, after all the staff had gone home and the security guard was away from his desk, She crept into the orphanage staff's office and found her file. Reading the form, she found that in the box where her mother's name should have been was written the word unknown. Then, to make matters worse, she also found out that her last name, Smith, was the name given to her by the orphanage when she'd first arrived. With the hope of reuniting with her mother now shattered, Deborah became unreachable. These were the reasons behind why, as she approached the age of 10, she suddenly became a difficult and completely unmanageable child. The change in her behavior was noticed by everyone, including her classmates and friends, but no one, not even her social worker nor teachers, were able to persuade Deborah to open up to them about what was bothering her. Her resentment at being born an orphan only increased as she entered her early teens, and soon afterward turned into a resentment for having been born at all. Over the next 3 years, her behavior continued to decline until finally, at 13 years old, she dropped out of school and ran away from the orphanage. The staff, by this time, still unable to get through to her, were happy to see her go, and other than filling out the paperwork to officially record her absence, did nothing to find or return her to the facility. After dropping out of school and running away, Deborah was happy. Happy to be away from not feeling equal to the other kids who lived at home with their parents, happy to be away from feeling that her clothes were not good enough, and happy to be away from having to be the good girl, because she found none of that while living on the streets. She quickly fell into the potentially self-destructive lifestyle of prostitution, petty crimes, and drugs. At least on the street, nobody judges your clothes or where you live, she thought, and being free from those feelings of shame meant more to her than anything else did at the time. She became a familiar member of the homeless community in and around Philly, and soon gained the distinction of being known as that smart little girl who knows her way around these streets. After years of surviving on the dangerous streets of Philly, Deborah became pregnant with Gary at 15 years old by a 37-year-old man named Sam Watson. Sam. Sam was already married when he met her. His was the typical case of a man who was living a double life. He worked hard at creating and maintaining the outward appearance of a decent, law-abiding, middle-aged husband from the suburbs. But then on the weekends, he traveled to the inner-city neighborhoods where he sought out only younger girls who were living in poverty. With offers of money or drugs for sexual favors, was almost always the young girl's first experience with prostitution. But he was by no means trying to satisfy his ego's desire to play the role of a pimp, and as such, he had 2 rules. Number 1, he only wanted girls no younger than 13 and no older than 15. And number 2, he only saw one girl at a time. Sam saw himself more as a benefactor to these young girls, convincing himself that he was helping them by putting them up in rooms for the weekend if they were homeless, and purchasing their food and drugs when he would visit. The relationships usually only lasted long enough for the girl to do better for herself, and it was always the girl who ended the relationship with him. He had grown comfortable with his routine, coming to rely heavily upon the financial upper hand that he maintained over the underage girls. But he'd met his match when it came to Deborah. He was unaware that she was an orphan, who had run away from the orphanage now a full year earlier, and was by that time no stranger to the streets. Nor was he aware that she was brighter than the other young and naive girls that he'd used before on his weekend trips to the city. After their first night together, one spent drinking, doing drugs, and having sex in the motel room, he woke in the early morning hours and left her sleeping, like he had grown accustomed to doing with so many underage girls before. He was half the way to his home in the affluent Philly suburbs when he realized that he did not have his wallet. He immediately returned to the motel room to find Deborah, now awake and sitting in the chair. "Well, hey there," she said coyly as soon as he entered the room. "I didn't want you to leave without saying goodbye," she said, holding up his missing wallet between her fingers, waving it back and forth. He stood unmoving, in shock and surprise, still holding the door open, frozen in place. "I used your credit card and paid the room up for the month. They registered the room in the other name on the card, you know, your wife's name. They thought it was me, but don't worry, I told them I was your daughter. They didn't blink an eye. So now you know where to find me when you come back next weekend. Oh, and another thing, Sam, I expect to be busy all week, so don't come back here until Friday evening, okay?" Sam now knew well enough, but too late, that although she never came right out and said it, Deborah would expose his activities, not only to his wife if he caused her to, but because she was underage, she could also go to the police if the mood ever struck her. Sam found himself a victim of his own schemes, and now trapped into a relationship with Deborah, the most powerful part of the relationship, leaving him walking a tightrope, unwilling to upset her. Sam had been a regular of Deborah's for a year by the time she became pregnant with his child. When he showed up at the motel room that Friday evening, she told him that she was pregnant with his baby. He understandably questioned his paternity, while making sure not to upset her in doing so. She knew that the only time she'd occasionally had unprotected sex was with him, so she wasn't upset by his request, because she already knew what the outcome would be. He offered to pay for her to take the test, proving that he was the father. She told him that they would go have the test performed the next day, but that because he did not believe her, he was not welcome to stay with her that night. Sam went back home to the suburbs, then returned the next morning. Together, they went to have her tested, and, with his paternity confirmed, almost as a punishment, she demanded that he now take her somewhere nice to eat. He drove around for an hour, indecisive about where to go to eat, when she finally chose an expensive restaurant. It was just after lunchtime, but Deborah ordered the most expensive steak entree from the dinner menu. When the waiter, while taking their order, explained that they had to order from the lunch menu or wait a few more hours until later in the afternoon, she became loud and adamant about what she wanted. Sam had to agree to pay the fee for having her meal prepared. As they ate, he offered to pay the cost for her to get an abortion, mistakenly thinking that she wanted to continue living her now established life of prostitution and wanted nothing to do with being pregnant. Then, when Deborah, for her own reasons, loudly and angrily refused his offer for her to get an abortion, the surprised Sam quickly backpedaled, hoping not to draw any further attention in the restaurant or anger her any further. After apologizing and trying to calm her down, Sam pleaded with her until she agreed to let him take care of her and his child. It was only when Deborah's baby bulge got so big that she could no longer find any men willing to pay her for sex that her mindset began to change. Finding herself now unable to earn any money, and with plenty of time to think, she began to recognize the vulnerable position that she had placed herself into, having now to completely rely on Sam for food and housing. At first, she just counted her blessings because, before she'd gotten pregnant, she'd often entertained the idea of telling him that she no longer wanted to see him. Now, though, because she was pregnant and had to count on Sam for everything, the reality of taking on the responsibility of raising a child began to take shape and sink in. She realized that, like now she had to count on Sam for everything, her child, too, would have to count on her for everything it would need to survive. Thoughts about her future and the future of her unborn child began to circulate and soon cascaded as if a dam had broken, letting all the possible outcomes of her pregnancy flood into her mind. Thoughts about her own life, being unwanted by whoever her mother was, started to surface, but it was the prospect of her baby being labeled by society as illegitimate that weighed the heaviest on her young mind. Feeling as though she had already let her child down, her outlook on life rapidly changed from one of resentment at being born to one of optimism and hope that centered on providing for the future of her unborn child. Refusing to return to a life of drugs and prostitution after she delivered her baby, Deborah made a vow to always be open and transparent about everything she'd done so that her child would not make the same mistakes in life that she did. While she was pregnant, Deborah used the time to take classes and earned her GED. Sam stayed true to his word and supported Deborah both before and after the birth of their son. He was even named Gary after Sam's father. After he was born, Deborah, constantly cradling her newborn baby boy in the same motel room where he was conceived, would talk to him, always emphasizing, despite his not being old enough to understand, that he was her miracle child, and that his being born was the reason why she changed her life. At that time, it was more for her than it was for Gary. Long before Gary was born, the weekend sex trips that Sam took to the city to be with Deborah had become a thing of the past. But that didn't mean he stopped coming to the city on the weekends. During her pregnancy, she saw him from time to time in the neighborhood with other girls, reinforcing her determination not to return to her previous lifestyle. After Gary was born, Sam's weekly visits to Deborah rarely lasted longer than an hour, just long enough for him to pay the week's rent for the room and to drop things off for the baby. Her attitude about Sam drastically changed after Gary was born. It was only for the sake of her son that she still smiled when he came to visit. He offered to pay for the room on a month-to-month basis, but Deborah rather that he didn't. She wanted him to come and see his child more than just once a month. Deborah's feelings for Sam fell far short of affection, and now even further still from respect. Deborah's changed outlook on her life and the future of her child would not allow her to simply live off Sam's generosity with no plan to provide for herself in the future. Still, she took full advantage of the support that he agreed to provide, and it wasn't until after Gary turned 3 years old that she felt comfortable enough to leave him with a daycare while she went out to search for a job. She put in many applications and soon landed a job as a waitress. She started earning tips her first day. For the very first time, she felt like a real mother to her son, proud at being able to buy diapers with her own money. The surge of pride reminded her of a feeling she had not felt since her early years of living at the orphanage, back when she was singled out for being the model orphan, when she felt special and unique. She rode on this feeling of accomplishment all week long, and her feeling good, she noticed, led to an increase in tips for her at the diner. She was still young, and her first experience with this well-known mystery of life was epiphanic, and made her want to share it with the world. Her opinion of Sam had not changed, but when he came to visit, she shared with him her good feelings and the good news that she now had a job. It was then that she first learned the cost and paid the price for sharing herself with the wrong people. After Sam left, she noticed that the amount of money that he normally left for her and Gary was now much, much less. She recognized her mistake too late, and it led to her mood changing back to one of bitterness and survival. The amount of money from the tips that she made went down, but it didn't bother her because she was now more comfortable with a chip on her shoulder than she was being happy. After Deborah had been working for 2 weeks, she received her first paycheck. It was the first paycheck that she had ever received in her life, but now she knew better than to tell Sam about it. But Sam already knew when she would get paid from experience, knowing that it was only on the higher wage earning jobs that one has to wait a month before the first paycheck. So, without a word, the weekend visits from Sam abruptly stopped. But Deborah couldn't have been happier. Her only motivation by this time was being a mother, and that meant she was doing it all on her own and did not have to rely on anyone to take care of her and her baby. She paid her weekly rent, bought food, paid for daycare, and was left with no money. Still, she proudly thought, I am a mother and I am really doing it. After struggling to make ends meet for 2 months waitressing at the diner, she came home and found a letter taped to her door. It was a letter from the U.S. Postal Service informing her that her application for a position with the Postal Service had been accepted. She found the process of getting hired at the post office to be complicated, very different than getting hired as a waitress, and she had to take many days off from the diner to complete it. But 30 days after receiving the letter, she found herself now an 18-year-old single mother working for the post office. This was a huge step up from her past working experience waiting tables. It was her first real job where she was paid a salary instead of being paid hourly or by tips, and the very first job where she was able to receive medical benefits for her and her son. Deborah quickly settled into the notion that this was going to be the last job she would work. She soon came to view this job at the post office as a career decision, deciding to work there long enough to see Gary through high school or maybe even college, and, if need be, for the rest of my life or retirement, whichever comes first, she thought amusingly. Deborah's first day on the job was charged with enthusiasm and appreciation that came through in her personality and her performance at the office where she was assigned. She made it a point to get along with coworkers, all of them older, and most were victims of the repetitive nature of the job, having fallen into a mindset of not caring anymore. It took almost 2 weeks before they warmed up to her, because she never let anything they did get her down. Her attitude and presence in the office raised all of the spirits and made coming to work something that they began to appreciate again. She also caught the attention of Travis Edwards, the supervisor at the office where she was assigned. Chapter 2: New Beginnings. On the surface, it seemed that Gary was born into the same circumstances that have a common tendency to leave a child with a dismal outlook on the future, much in the same way that it did his mother. His beginning, like so many others born to an unwed teenage mother and raised in an inner-city environment, could have been instrumental in the shaping of negative choices on his part. But, because of his mother's teachings, in Gary's case, those circumstances only served as background in a painting, only capable of illustrating a broadly stroked picture of his life. The details contained within, however, did not permit him to fall victim to the environment or the circumstances that he was born into. His formative years were spent in daycare, but it was the type of daycare that didn't teach the kids anything, the only kind that his mother could afford while employed waiting tables. Here, he was exposed to children that had been forced to grow up very early in their lives. His interaction with them created his first-time introspective feelings of feeling different. He saw how they behaved and knew it was wrong, but when none of the adults at the daycare did anything to correct them, he became confused and withdrew, wishing that he were somewhere, anywhere else, at the place and with the only adult that he knew he could trust. After turning 3 years old, the age when he first recalled meeting Sam, Gary was afraid of him and refused to spend time alone with him. But after seeing him come to visit his mother several more times, Gary slowly became used to him, and they were able to start spending time together without him needing his mother around. Gary was too young at that time to understand the concept of what a father was, but it was during his time spent with Sam that he began to better understand the different kind of adults. He came to see that just because they were different did not mean that they were bad. Still, he was never able to develop a fondness for Sam. Instead, he enjoyed the excitement of seeing and sometimes meeting different people and the different places they went whenever they went away together. The first time that he met Travis, however, made him feel happy, and he liked it. Gary was still too young to know it, but his intuition was at work, leaving him only aware that he liked Travis but didn't like Sam. After Travis started showing up, Gary never even noticed that weekend visits from Sam stopped. He only recognized how happy both he and his mother were when Travis was around. Around this same time, Gary also stopped going to daycare and started going to kindergarten. On his first day at kindergarten, Gary noticed almost immediately that most, but not all of the kids in kindergarten behaved the same way that the kids did at daycare, but the adults in kindergarten were very different. They were always concerned with what the kids were doing, and no bad behavior was left unchecked. He was thrilled. Some of the kids continued to misbehave anyway, but by this time he was no longer bothered by what he saw of their behavior. Instead of remaining sullen and withdrawn like he felt when he was at daycare, he enjoyed his time alone at kindergarten. When he wasn't being taught with the other students by their teachers, he was looking at the pictures in books, which fed his hungry imagination. After going through all the pictures in all of the books, he then began trying to understand the symbols that he saw with the pictures, knowing that there was something more to them that could feed his imagination as well. Travis was one of the youngest supervisors ever to serve in the Postal Service, after having been promoted 1 year earlier at the age of 23. He graduated early from college with a BSBA in Business Administration and was hired almost immediately by the Postal Service. Paul Edwards, his father, now retired, was a lifelong Postal Service employee who for years had desired the position of supervisor, but because of his lack of education, was unqualified to fill it. He tried going back to school in his earlier years with the post office, but the ongoing situation at home with his wife caused him to have to drop his classes. After eventually becoming a single father, he spent many years guiding his son on the educational path needed to become the supervisor that he himself was unable to become. Even with the years of preparation, it was a very difficult and remarkable thing for Travis to accomplish at so young an age. The postal supervisor nearest his age was almost twice his age, at 45, and had been working with the Postal Service for 20 years before he'd been promoted. After passing his supervisor's exam, he was personally awarded his promotion by the Postmaster General, who commended him on being one of the youngest supervisors in the country. He was expecting to be congratulated by his peers, but found himself often ridiculed and targeted, the butt of many unflattering jokes instead. Ironically, it was because of his age that he had been made to feel inadequate by his older, jealous supervisor colleagues. The negative opinions of him that were subtly held, and on occasion openly displayed by the other supervisors, caused him to work extra hard at his job, even going so far as sending some of his staff to temporarily work at other offices to assist the other supervisors, leaving his office short-handed, with himself having to work harder to make up for the loss of manpower, all in the hopes of persuading the supervisors to change their opinion of him. But now, after months of working double shifts and with no change in sight, he was reaching his breaking point. He contemplated quitting, knowing that with his degree he could easily find another job, but it was in disappointing his father that had him doubting he would ever really quit, and it was this obligation that was ultimately responsible for why he felt trapped. When Deborah was hired and started working at his location, he found her youthful attitude invigorating and irresistible. Her presence in the office was a boost to everyone's mood, and she demonstrated the values and work ethic that he had long been seeking in a partner, but never expected to find in someone his age, much less someone younger than he was. Working alongside Deborah gave him the emotional relief that he so desperately needed from his situation involving the other supervisors, and his thoughts about quitting the Postal Service almost immediately disappeared. The atmosphere in the office changed, and the co-workers began having potluck lunches and even going to movies together after work. The older folks in the office started pushing the two young people to get together, and after a few months, Travis and Deborah became romantically involved. After they started dating, he told Deborah that after he graduated from college, he moved back home to be with his father, who'd retired from the Postal Service and needed his help at home. He explained that his father wasn't disabled, but that he had problems dealing with people, and he wanted to be there to help him so that he wouldn't be alone. She let him know that she fully appreciated his loyalty and responsibility to his father. Deborah was all about family, never having had the experience herself. She also recognized that if they ever wanted to be able to spend time alone together, it would be a good idea for her to move out of the motel and to get her own place. After all, she thought, who knew when Sam was going to show up again? As she neared the point of having saved enough money to move out into her own apartment, Sam reappeared. She told him that she was moving, purposefully not giving him her address, and that because she now had a boyfriend, she no longer needed him to come by. She expected him to take the opportunity to not have to involve himself in her life anymore. But Sam only showed up because he was feeling vindictive, after feeling trapped for so many years with her having the upper hand and him having to do her bidding. By now, enough time had elapsed where he was sure that her job at the diner would have run its course, and he expected to find her struggling. He came prepared to give her money, but the main reason was that he wanted to gloat. Finding out that she was moving was a shock for him, and when she said he no longer needed to come by, he lied, professing that he only wanted to stay in touch with his son, and he should be allowed to do that. Deborah, only somewhat moved, agreed to allow him to see Gary in the future, but only if he agreed to abide by her terms. If he truly wanted to see his son in the future, it would be only after calling and letting her know beforehand when he wanted to come and visit. He immediately agreed, and she gave him her phone number, but nothing about the address to where she was moving. She did not want the occasional visits from him to interfere in her relationship with Travis in any way, so before they met, she told Travis everything. She first had to overcome her fear that he would want to break up with her, after she confessed what her life was like before they met. It took time, but she reluctantly came clean to him about her entire life before she was hired at the post office. Then she told him in detail about her relationship with Sam, identifying him as Gary's biological father. She was taking a gamble, but it was better to be up front now than to let her past come back to haunt her later. When they did finally meet one another, there was nothing that Sam would be able to tell Travis that she hadn't already told him. Even so, she told Travis to expect him to lie. She was relieved and gained a new level of respect for Travis when he expressed how much he respected and admired her, having learned what she had to overcome to be where she was now. Still, she was able to keep the two from meeting for many months afterward. When they finally did meet, it was during one of the infrequent times when Sam came to pick Gary up for a Sunday afternoon together. Deborah introduced them to one another and then rushed Sam to go, keeping the interaction between them to a bare minimum. At the same time, Travis also had to keep the contact between Deborah and his father to the bare minimum. From the moment Travis mentioned Deborah and who she was, Paul became agitated, even furious, making it clear that he was against their relationship. Travis mistakenly assumed that his father was just having a bad day, and a week later, he tried again to talk with him about Deborah. But Paul's reaction was the same. After that, Travis stopped telling his father about her altogether. The only times he reluctantly mentioned her name to him were the times when asked, he would tell his father not to expect him home for the weekend because he would be spending it at her apartment. Paul never had any comments about it one way or the other, but he then wouldn't talk to his son sometimes for days after he returned. Around the middle of the school year, Gary started getting picked up from kindergarten by his mother and Travis. They went home together and had fun every day. He'd expected it to end after a few days, like it had been before, but Travis kept showing up with his mother, and they kept going home together every day. He loved having Travis around, and soon came to expect it, feeling happy and proud of having two parents. These were one of the happiest times in his life. Travis, Deborah, and Gary grew closer in the next few months, with Travis now sometimes staying over during the weekdays instead of just on the weekends. Paul, having finally grown tired of his son spending so much time over at Deborah's apartment, gave his son an ultimatum. Either you stop seeing that woman, or I want you out of here. After the outburst from his father, Travis called Deborah and explained why he would not be coming over to visit for a while, choosing to wait until his father cooled off. But when he returned home from work the next day, he found all his belongings in plastic bags on the front porch, and the lock on the front door changed. Standing on the front porch, he took out his phone and tried to call his father, but found that he could not get through. Paul had blocked his number. Travis reluctantly put his belongings in his car, then moved in with Deborah and Gary. With Travis now there all the time, Gary was visibly happy and excited, and their bond grew even stronger. Sam's calls to Deborah to see his son had long ago dwindled to intermittent, and now, as she told him that Travis was living with them, the calls from Sam stopped completely. The next few months were the happiest times in all of their lives. Deborah and Travis learned how much they shared the same values and views on family. When he explained that he'd learned them all from his father, she remained skeptical but kept it to herself. It wasn't long after that they became engaged to be married. They shared the news with their office family because neither of them had anyone else that they could share the news with. They set the date for their wedding to take place before Gary went to the first grade. She had confided in Travis, and they both agreed that Gary should enter the school system with the last name Edwards instead of the name Smith that she privately despised. After a 2-year courtship, Travis and Deborah were married. It was a small ceremony, but one attended by all of their co-workers who celebrated the marriage as if it were their own children. After his mother married Travis, they moved away from the inner city to a much nicer neighborhood in the suburbs. With the start of the next school year approaching, Gary, with so many new things happening in his life at the same time, and too embarrassed to tell his mother, confided in Travis his fear of going to the new school. Travis consoled his stepson and explained to him what school was and how it operated. When Travis was done, Gary felt proud at no longer having to go to kindergarten. Instead, he now understood that he would be going into the first grade as a big boy. So it was that he entered the first grade as Gary Edwards, growing up as a happy and well-adjusted child. Months after they'd gotten married, Sam started calling again. Deborah told him that she didn't have time to talk right now and for him to call back. Then she told Travis. Now, as her husband and Gary's stepfather, he was fiercely protective of his family, and he was the one who answered the phone when Sam called back. Speaking sternly to him, chastising him about how his inconsistent behavior was affecting Gary's life, Travis told him that if he wanted to see his son, he would have to first meet with him to discuss what was in Gary's best interest. Sam's first reaction was to curse the younger man out, but then just as quickly held his tongue, remembering that Deborah could still expose him to his wife, who still knew nothing about her or Gary. So he made it a point to also treat Travis with the same cautious respect that he held for Deborah. He agreed to meet with Travis, who decided that it would be better for them to meet at a bar near their house, where they would not be around Deborah or Gary. This was to be the first time the two actually had a chance to talk to one another. Travis sat at a table in the bar and watched as Sam came in. Watching him now, he could tell instantly that Sam had been her sugar daddy back in the day, even if she hadn't already told him. And it wasn't because of their age difference. It was evident in his demeanor. Sam exuded the same distinctive underlying cowardice that pedophiles naturally exhibit when in public, a weakness about them, usually only noticeable by other men, and Travis saw it instantly. When Sam came up and extended his hand, Travis ignored it. Instead, he told him to sit and then tested him by asking how he and Deborah came to know one another. Sam, knowing that Travis already knew the answer, was still unwilling to admit or even accept the truth about himself, that he was a pedophile who routinely messed around with underage girls. He only said that when they met, he saw something in her that was special and told her that he was there for her if she ever needed him. Travis's limited respect for Sam began at that moment, because he didn't lie and answered with a tact that Travis wasn't expecting. Now the conversation between them turned to Gary, and how even though he was always going to be Gary's father, if he was not going to be a constant and consistent part of his life, then he should call asking to come visit just on holidays and Gary's birthday, so that Gary knew when to expect him and didn't have to live with being disappointed otherwise, in case he didn't show up. Sam agreed with the terms, but was privately thinking that he was going to stay as far away from the three of them as he could. But then, of course, he lied, expressing a false desire to be able to see his son on occasions other than just holidays. "I know Gary would like that," Travis replied. With their meeting now over, Sam extended his hand to Travis, who this time took it, only momentarily surprised at how weak the man's grasp was in the handshake. Chapter 3. Gary. His first year at school was full of fun, wonder, and discovery. He loved his teachers and made many friends. His intuition kept him away from the troublemakers and bad kids in his classes, so much so that soon he didn't even realize they were there. He loved school, like his mother did at the same age, and looked forward to going every day with enthusiasm. He even cried at the end of the school year after learning that school had come to an end for the summer. It was only after Travis explained it to him that his crying became sniffles and then stopped altogether. He became at ease with school coming to an end after learning that it was going to start back up the next year, and that when he returned, he would be in the second grade, where only the bigger boys are allowed to go. He spent his summer months in day camp with his books, using what he had learned in the first grade about sounding out words, teaching himself to read. Throughout the summer, he had been told on 2 different occasions to be ready to go for a visit with Sam. Both times he dreaded having to go, but he didn't want to hurt Sam's feelings, so he said nothing. And both times something came up, and Sam was unable to make it. Gary was so overjoyed each time that his visit with Sam had been canceled that he came to believe that wishing, but not saying anything about it, just like when making a wish blowing out the candles on his birthday cake, was the way to get out of doing something that he really didn't want to do. As the start of second grade drew near, he was surprised when his parents took him clothes shopping, letting him pick out what he wanted to wear at school. It was the first time that he'd felt what it was like to be the one in control, the one with the final say in picking out his own clothes, and it made him feel empowered. He began thinking how much he liked being a big boy, and it started going to his head. After they got back home from shopping, he started acting differently, displaying signs of impudence, especially when he was told it was time for him to go to bed. Deborah had a talk with him as he lay in bed before going to sleep. She told him about the time when, as a little girl, she was in school, and the kids made fun of her because she didn't have new clothes for school. She told him how much it hurt her, and that she did not want him to do that to some other kids by mistake when he went back to school. He lay in bed awake for hours after she left, thinking, and eventually made a promise to himself. I will never do that to anybody, especially not my friends, before he finally fell asleep. Second grade started, and he never said a word about his new clothes, even when it was all that so many of the other kids were talking about. Instead, he joined the conversation and started talking about the books that he'd learned to read over the summer. He was confused that his classmates had no interest in what he was talking about, and that only his teachers did, later asking him to stand up in front of the class to talk about the books he'd read. His classmates had not yet learned how to read, and Gary started feeling different again, the memories of daycare beginning to surface in the back of his mind. But as his teachers called on him time and time again to stand in front of the class and read aloud, he began to proudly accept feeling different from the other students. As the school year neared the halfway point, notes were sent home informing the parents that the school district map they had lived in had been redrawn. The teachers instructed the students to have the notes signed by their parents and then return them to school. Deborah and Travis learned that Gary was going to have to go to a different school the next year. They anticipated that this would sadden him, so they had him sit in the living room, giving him a big bowl of ice cream with sprinkles on top as they broke the news. After they told him, to their surprise, he simply replied, "Okay." Then, without another word, he went back to savoring the ice cream. Deborah and Travis bit a hasty retreat from the conversation at that point, neither wanting to push their luck, and both thankful that Gary was becoming emotionally mature. As for Gary, he answered this way because he'd been expecting to hear that he wouldn't be going to this school anymore. He still loved going to school, but at the start of the school year, when he first started feeling like he was different from the other kids in his class, he began wishing that he didn't have to be there anymore. Remembering what he'd learned about not saying out loud what you really want, especially when it might hurt someone else's feelings, because he didn't want to hurt his teacher's feelings, he never said a word about it to anyone. If I'm gonna feel different than everybody else here, I'd rather be at another place where I'm new and feel different for that reason. He'd kept these thoughts to himself at the start of the year, so now, in the middle of the school year, Gary enjoyed his ice cream without giving the news a second thought. So, as his second grade school year came to an end, Gary said goodbye to his teachers and to the students who were not leaving, the few that he still called friends. Most of his other classmates had, by then, completely shifted their opinion of Gary, giving him the unflattering nickname Mr. Goody-Goody, the teacher's pet, because of the envy they felt when the teachers found out that he could read and made him out to be the examples for them to imitate. Fortunately for Gary, he confided in Travis about what was happening at school as soon as he started feeling different. Travis told him to do his best, no matter what other people were doing, because everybody's best is different. This is why Gary spent the majority of that school year unconcerned with his classmates' opinions about him, and why the nickname never bothered him a single bit. At 8 years old and starting the third grade at a new school, because his aptitude for reading and writing was now part of his school record, he was tested and placed in the 98th percentile. Because of these results, he was urged to enter into the school spelling contest. He was reluctant to participate, though, because of the way things developed when he entered the second grade. He didn't want a repeat performance of kids thinking badly of him, especially since he was supposed to compete against them in the spelling bee. He only wanted to make friends at his new school, but he did not want to upset his new teachers either. In the end, it was the repeated urging of his new teachers that won out, and he relented, finally agreeing to participate in the spelling contest. As his teachers predicted would happen, Gary won the third grade spelling bee. Deborah and Travis were informed by the school about Gary's success. When they picked him up from school, they celebrated his victory by taking him out for an ice cream sundae. After that, he looked forward to participating, happy at making his parents proud. Following the third grade spelling bee victory, he was entered into and won the fourth grade spelling bee, then the fifth grade spelling bee, then the sixth. When he defeated the much older students in the seventh grade, to his surprise, he started making friends with kids not only in the third grade, but with older kids in the higher grades as well. His reputation at his new school soared, and he found himself popular and welcomed by all the students he met at his new school. Gary was now happier than he'd ever been in his life, even happier than when Travis came to live with them. He then went on to win the regional spelling bee, after which he was selected to represent his entire school district, which involved traveling to California to participate in the Scripps National Spelling Bee. This trip marked the first time that Gary had ever been apart from his mother and stepfather, and the first time feelings of homesickness set in, distracting the young 8-year-old, causing him to only make it to the third round of the Scripps National Spelling Bee before he was eliminated. Being eliminated so early in the competition caused him to feel ashamed and embarrassed, and like a typical young child, he began to regret agreeing to participate in the spelling bee in the first place. He imagined that because of his failure, all of his newfound friends would no longer want to be his friend anymore. When Gary returned home from the competition, his feelings of homesickness disappeared, and he yearned for the familiarity of his life before he got involved in the spelling bee. Expecting the loss of friends, he was surprised and could not understand why he was treated like some kind of a celebrity. He was even interviewed and appeared in a segment of the local news. Feeling as though all the attention was undeserved because he didn't win, and thought it only highlighted him as a failure, he grew to dislike the attention he was now receiving. He saw himself as just a regular kid who enjoyed going outside to play and watching cartoons on Saturday morning, and he couldn't help but notice that everything was different now, and that winning the spelling bee seemed to cause a shift in the behavior of all the people in his life. After the news segment about him appeared on the television, Sam suddenly called Deborah, asking if arrangements could be made for him to start spending more time with Gary. Dubious about his true motives, she first discussed it with Travis, who also agreed that it seemed like Sam was only acknowledging his son because he was in some way seeking to profit off of Gary's newfound celebrity. Whether it was true or not, they both reluctantly agreed that if for nothing else, because of his support of Gary and Deborah in the past, he had at least earned the right to see his son to celebrate his victory. But they made it clear that whether he would continue to see his son or not was up to Gary to decide. After he returned home from his time with Sam, when asked if he wanted to continue going with him, Gary agreed to it, having already been persuaded by promises that he could have ice cream and cotton candy whenever they went out together. Sundays were now spent on outings with Sam instead of watching the cartoons that he loved. Sam started taking him to the park, the zoo, and the many museums in Philadelphia. They went to many historical landmarks, and on one occasion, Sam even took him to attend an opera in full black tie dress. It was all done in Sam's hope of leaving a positive image of himself in Gary's childhood memory. The truth behind Sam's newfound attention to his son involved him playing the long odds when it came to his son. He firmly believed that one day Gary was going to make a lot of money, and Sam wanted to be on his good side when that day came. He could not escape his true nature of living a double life, doing the right thing for his son for all the wrong reasons. And there were even more changes happening in Gary's life. These changes, however, were the ones that he had little control over. On Sunday, after having gone to the same church ever since he could remember, he was now being introduced to members of the congregation that he had never seen before. Everyone that he was introduced to seemed to have the same interest in him becoming a part of their youth groups that, again, he had never known even existed in the church before. The changes even extended to the attitudes of his friends from his old neighborhood, friends that he had grown up with and played with his whole life. He was saddened at having to leave all of them after they moved, but was encouraged by his mother to stay in contact with them. She even offered to take him back to their old neighborhood, or even bring them over to their new house to visit whenever he wanted. They're just like a part of your family, Gary, and staying connected to family is very important, she told him. Now, after his having appeared on the news, when they came out to the new house to play, they came seeking his opinion and advice on schoolwork and other things, instead of just coming over to play like they used to. Some of them even began bringing friends with them, introducing Gary to people who took it upon themselves to call him their friend. He didn't know these people, but he played along anyway, hearing his mother's voice echoing in his mind, "You can never have enough friends, right?" Sometimes these new friends would invite him to their birthday parties or would come over to his house uninvited, looking for him to come out and play with them. At school, he was suddenly introduced to an entirely new curriculum, one that took him away from his regular classes for a week at a time, that had him sitting in classes with students in higher grades. All of these changes were coming very fast to Gary at only 8 years old. He never wanted any of it, and did not gladly embrace any of these changes. He was soon overwhelmed by the sheer number of things that were now different in his life, privately feeling like it was no longer his life at all. Finding the changes too numerous to take on, he finally resigned himself to accept what was happening to his life, and for the next 4 years, he just played along and went with the flow. He spent his Saturdays with Sam, and in different classes at school. He met more and more people that seemed to know him, yet he had never seen them before. He entered the spelling bee each year, and each year he won, moving on to the national level, each time getting further in the script spelling bee than the year before. And each year he was interviewed by the local news every time he returned home. In time, he became skilled at saying the right thing and telling people what they wanted to hear, and everyone that knew him thought he was the luckiest kid in the world. Chapter 4. Gary's Choice. It was the end of the school week, a week that found Gary sitting in the advanced placement classes away from his friends. Now, just minutes before the school bell rang, setting the students free for the weekend, he was looking forward to next week, when things returned back to normal, and he returned to sitting in classes with his friends and kids his own age. After being picked up when they got home, Gary checked the mail. His parents had made it clear that after working for the post office all day, they needed a break from it when they got home, and left checking the mailbox as a chore for Gary. He retrieved the stack of mail, and within it found a letter addressed to him. He was surprised and hurriedly opened the letter. It was an invitation to the birthday party of Jerry, one of his best friends from the old neighborhood. It was just the thing he needed after the week he'd just been through. He was looking forward to being around people that he knew. After getting permission to attend from his parents, He called and let Jerry know that he would be there. Because of his being on television 4 different times, Gary's popularity, especially in the inner city neighborhood where he used to live, was huge. It was Jerry's birthday, but everyone wanted to know if Gary was going to be there. Jerry was happy to tell everyone he could that Gary had agreed to attend his party. There were so many people that wanted to be there that it was shaping up to be the party of a lifetime for Jerry. When Travis and Deborah pulled up to the party with Gary in the back seat, he was welcomed at the car by almost everyone who was there, in the usual celebrity status that he'd learned to put up with, but still had not grown accustomed to. As he got out of the car, the noisy crowd of kids surrounded him, slowly making their way to the house. Deborah and Travis watched with pride and waited until they were inside, then looked at one another grinning before they pulled away, feeling happy for Gary. Once inside, after some of the fuss over Gary calmed down, he was introduced to a few people that he'd never met before, one of whom was a girl named Denise Robinson. As soon as they looked at one another, Gary developed an instant liking for her. There was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel different, a feeling he'd never felt before. He didn't know what it was, but he liked it and wanted it to continue. As long as he talked to her, that feeling kept going. So he kept talking to her, and she seemed to feel the same way about him. Throughout the course of the party, he and Denise enjoyed each other's company almost exclusively. When the party was over and it was time to go, they exchanged phone numbers and the promise to call one another. This was the first time in his life that he felt a liking for a girl as something more than just a friend, and the desire to talk to this girl again consumed him. Deborah and Travis came to pick him up after the party, and while on the drive home, they asked him how he enjoyed the party. Gary had become skilled at telling his parents what they wanted to hear, and in his practiced, cheery tone, he even embellished parts of the story that he shared with them about seeing his friends and details about the party games that they all played at the party. Then, before he knew it, he blurted out about his meeting Denise and how he could have talked to her all night long. He was opening up and sharing his true feelings, animated and excited. He told them how he had gotten her number and held it up so they could see it. Deborah continued looking forward, smiling as she listened, but Travis had heard the difference in his voice when he started talking about Denise and glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He saw the look on Gary's face as he held up the slip of paper. Then he glanced over at Deborah to see if she really understood what Gary was telling them, but she seemed oblivious, so he said nothing and kept on driving. Deborah, in the meantime, told Gary how happy she was for him and how lucky he was to meet someone that he liked so early in his life. Again, Travis glanced at Deborah, who was just looking forward with a huge smile on her face. He could clearly see how happy she was feeling for her son, so he chose not to say anything. Instead, he only chuckled to himself and returned his eyes to the road. He was privately amused, thinking, "My wife has no idea what is in store for her now that her son is 12 years old, just reaching puberty, and now has, for the first time in his life, just fallen in love, and all of it happening at the same time." Travis mouthed a silent whistle as he continued driving home. When Gary heard his mother say the word lucky, it jarred something in his mind, bringing to the surface all those times he'd been told by people how lucky he was to have been able to go to California and be on TV, happening alongside the thoughts he was having about his future with Denise. He'd suddenly fallen quiet as he rode in the back seat, Deborah turning around to see if he was okay. She saw him staring out the window and thought no more about it. But Gary was in the process of realizing how important it had suddenly become for him to know what really was behind Denise's liking for him.
He had been simply going along with the popularity he gained over the past few years because of his participation in the spelling bee, and now began to wonder if it was his popularity that had caused Denise to like him, or if she liked him for him. It was as important to him as a matter of life and death, because his hopes for a relationship with Denise could not be allowed to rest on him having to maintain the image of being the popular kid that he'd allowed himself to become. So it was that in the car that night, on the way home from the party, he quietly made the choice. No matter what the cost, I am going to stop playing along with being popular. Gary was good at thinking things through when he wanted to, so he purposefully chose not to consider what might happen because of his choice, because he knew that he might not go through with it if he did. He convinced himself that his entire life's happiness, one that included a future with Denise, was now on the line, and that no matter what happened as a result of his choice, because of that, it was worth it. He was, after all, operating with the mindset of a 12-year-old boy who had just fallen in love for the first time in his life. The changes that he made in his life started the next week at school, after the entire student body unanimously nominated him for class president. It was a remarkable event, with Gary being so popular that for the first time in the history of the school, there wasn't one student willing to run against him. Then, to everyone's amazement and disbelief, he declined. And then, a week later, when his teachers came to take him to his advanced classes, he refused to go. That following Sunday, Gary adamantly refused to go to church until finally, so that they wouldn't be late themselves, Travis and Deborah went on without him. Emboldened by his victory over his parents' wishes, Gary not only stopped going to church, but he stopped attending the youth groups that he was involved with at the church as well. These sudden changes in his behavior caused Deborah to worry about her son, wondering what was wrong with him. Deborah was understandably stressed by what was happening, but it began to manifest in profound ways. Travis did his best to explain to her about young boys when they reach puberty, but she was convinced that there was something else behind his behavior change, convinced that it was a result of his genetic link to his father. When she tried to tell Travis, he listened and then dismissed it from being something that drastic. For the first time, she began feeling like what she said did not matter to Travis, and it was a feeling that would not go away. Gary, in the meantime, was no longer telling his parents what they wanted to hear. When asked what was wrong with going to church and being in the youth groups, he insisted that he was fine and that everything was good. He simply did not want to go to church or be involved in the groups anymore. The answer he gave satisfied him, but not his parents. Over the next few weeks, whenever another instance of Gary's normal behavior changed, Deborah, and sometimes Travis, continued to ask him what was wrong, or if he was okay, or what was going on with him. All while this was happening, Gary and Denise's relationship was growing stronger. They would talk on the phone every day for hours after school, or all day on the weekends. Travis had some success getting Deborah to see that it was because of Gary's being in love and his wanting to be on the phone for hours every day as the reason behind why he didn't want to go to church or participate in the youth groups anymore, and not a genetic thing. Deborah reluctantly agreed that it could be the reason, but she was harboring an unspoken resentment for Travis even as he said it. One night, while they were sitting in the living room watching television together, they overheard Gary in his bedroom talking on the phone with Denise. Travis looked at Deborah. "Now see, that boy is in love." "I heard you the first time," Deborah snapped. the words coming out of her mouth before she even knew that she'd said them. Caught completely off guard by what he'd heard, Travis again turned to look at Deborah. "What?" he said, sounding angry and confused. She quickly snuggled up to Travis on the couch they shared. "I just meant that you were right, honey." Deborah tried to repair the damage she'd caused to Travis's mood by stroking his cheek, then holding his face in her hands as she kissed him on the lips. Travis was still angry. He was tense and stiff and remained unmoving. So Deborah stayed where she was and kept kissing him until he finally gave in and kissed her back. They kissed for some time afterward. "That's my Travis," she said cheerfully, before retreating back to her side of the couch to watch the television. Chapter 5. A Father's Duty. Over the coming months, Travis had to continue reassuring Deborah that Gary was just going through the growing pains of puberty, being a young boy in love. Deborah's stress over Gary continued to grow, however, and she still remained unconvinced. The mounting stress that she was under finally reached a peak one night. At the dinner table, she told Gary that because he was acting so differently in school and not attending church, she and Travis wanted him to go to talk to a therapist. Gary got angry at this and screamed at both of them, telling them that he was fine and to just leave him alone. He left the dinner table and stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. Left sitting alone at the dinner table with Deborah, Travis looked at her. He was searching for some kind of recognition from her because he knew that she knew they never had a discussion about Gary seeing a therapist. He knew it was the stress that she was under that was responsible for her lie, but he expected her to talk about it with him now that they were alone. He waited, but she said nothing. Travis recognized that he had the responsibility to his wife and his stepson to do more than he was doing. He could feel the situation growing out of control, but he was cautious about taking Gary's side, and even more hesitant to get in between Deborah and her son, so he said nothing. For the first time in his marriage, Travis felt the inner frustration that comes with being a stepfather, and also for the first time in his marriage, the feeling of being trapped, caused by the situation with Gary's behavior. It was a feeling he hadn't felt since he'd contemplated quitting his job at the post office before he met Deborah. It was a first-time situation for all involved. After the confrontation at the dinner table, Gary's relationship with his parents changed, and he became a sudden, moody, and withdrawn pre-teenager. From then on, every day after school, Gary came home without a word, went to his room and closed the door, even refusing to join his parents for dinner anymore. He also refused to go with Sam on their Saturday outings anymore. After he was unsuccessful at getting his son to change his mind, Sam took his frustration out on Deborah and Travis, accusing them of turning Gary against him. The already barely tolerable relationship between Sam, Deborah, and Travis deteriorated into one of mistrust and resentment. Spurred on by not having an answer to Sam's accusation, Deborah was now determined to get to the bottom of what was happening with Gary and began questioning his friends to try to learn what was at the center of his behavioral change, only to find out that he had, one by one, cut them off as well. But the turning point for Gary came when, during one of their daily hours-long conversations, Denise asked Gary what was going on with him. He bristled at hearing these words again, immediately becoming defensive. He'd never shared with her the things that were happening in his relationship with his friends or his parents. He viewed his conversations and relationship with her as his oasis, his way to escape all the problems that he was going through. He even held that his relationship with Denise was the reason he could endure all of these problems. At 12 years old, he'd already imagined that his future marriage to Denise was the prize that he felt awaited him after he withstood all the problems that came with rejecting his popularity. Because of these feelings, he felt hurt, even heartbroken and betrayed after hearing her question him with the same words his mother used. Then she began telling him about how she'd come to hear from some of his friends that he'd refused the position of class president and that she simply wanted him to tell her why. For Gary, no longer wondering, because now he was certain that she only wanted to be with him because of his popularity, he broke it off with her, leaving her shocked. Lashing out at her was an impulsive reaction that he immediately regretted doing, but he could not take back what he'd said and felt the damage was already done. Now, he just wanted to be left alone and made no attempt to reconcile with her. In the meantime, the stress from Gary's changed behavior caused Deborah to begin lashing out at Travis. At first, he just let it slide, convincing himself that his cowardice was to blame for not stepping in earlier and doing what he could have done to smooth out the situation that resulted in his wife being under this stress. The feeling of frustration that he first felt that night at the dinner table had been steadily growing, now making him feel completely trapped once again. He tried talking about it with Deborah, but she had become increasingly difficult to talk to, until they started routinely having days where they said nothing to one another at all. He spent those weeks at work trying to get her to talk, hoping to work together to come up with a solution to the situation at home. But she refused all of his advances. The next day, after they arrived at work together, Deborah avoided him throughout the entire day. He never saw her even once. When the time came to leave, he looked for his wife, but she was nowhere to be found. He was still sitting in the car in the parking lot waiting for her when the last person to leave told him that they saw her boarding the city bus just after everyone got off. He thanked them and then drove over to his father's house to escape the stress of his life with Deborah. After Paul listened to his son venting about what was happening in his marriage, he offered for Travis to stay and have a drink while he put some steaks on the grill. Travis agreed, ready to take a well-needed break from everything that was happening. Paul never expressed to his son the reasons why he disapproved of his relationship with Deborah. He privately held that his son's marriage to a woman who already had another man's child was beneath him and interfered with his plans for Travis's future. So now, with the opportunity, he encouraged his son to forget about trying to save the world and just do what was best for him. Travis, looking for a way out of feeling trapped, decided to take his father's biased advice. After enduring 2 years of Deborah lashing out at him and seeing no end in sight, he'd finally had enough. When he returned home, it was just before midnight, and he found Deborah sleeping on the couch in the living room. He chose not to wake her. The next morning, after he woke up and found Deborah eating her breakfast alone in the living room, he went to her and announced that she no longer had to avoid him because he was moving out. He took the morning off from work and by lunchtime had finished moving back home with his father with his few belongings, again in the room that he once held as a child. Still feeling hurt and now bitter as well, he decided to take the whole day off from work, choosing to spend the day reconnecting with his father. They spent the rest of the day drinking and were both pretty drunk when, later that afternoon, Paul made a call to his lawyer. With Travis standing near, he explained his son's situation to his lawyer while on the speakerphone. Paul's lawyer said it happens all the time, reassuring Travis that he was not alone, but that he should be thinking about protecting himself because Deborah had already likely sought out a lawyer. It is a common practice among divorce lawyers. The first thing they advise their clients to do is to avoid any contact with their spouse until after the divorce. Everything the lawyer said explained Deborah's recent change in behavior, and although Travis felt like he was moving too fast, the lawyer was able to convince him that, despite his feelings, he was the one in the relationship who was behind. With Deborah already talking to a lawyer, he was the one who didn't recognize that their marriage was already over. It took some time, but both men were able to convince Travis that his marriage was over and that he had to file for divorce from Deborah before she filed for divorce from him. Deborah, in the meantime, had already decided to quit working at the post office after Travis followed through with his threat of moving out. The idea of seeing him every day at work was more than she was willing to deal with. She returned to the office only once again, the same morning that Travis started moving his belongings out of their house. She wrote and placed her letter of resignation on his desk, thankful that he was not in the office when she did so. Her earlier hopes of keeping the job for years to come had long since faded from her memory with the change in her son's behavior. The stress of what to do about Gary, and now her failed marriage, dominated her thoughts and behavior. She left without a word to anyone. Not satisfied with simply not working alongside Travis anymore, she decided the very next day that she and Gary would also move out of their home in the suburbs. It was an emotionally charged reaction to Travis abandoning them. She took Gary and returned to their old inner city neighborhood where, although the environment was harsh, loud, and dirty compared to where she was moving from, she felt a sense of welcome in familiar surroundings. Chapter 6. Denise. Denise, at 12 years old, has just been given the bad news by Gary that he no longer wants to talk with her. At the same time, she is faced with the reality that she will likely once again be returning to foster care. Carol, her mother, has not yet returned home after almost a week and has probably gotten arrested again while on one of her drug binges. These were trying times for the young Denise, but hardly the worst that she'd been through. The day after she was born, her grandfather, Jacob Robinson, died. Although still grieving the recent loss of her husband, it became clear to her grandmother, Kathy, while observing Carol's treatment of her newborn baby, that if she did not intervene, Denise would not survive. So it was Kathy who raised her, not her mother, until she passed away. Denise was 7 years old when Kathy died, and 8 years old the first time she was placed into foster care. Carol had gotten arrested again for possession of drugs, but this time was unable to use her mother's well-known reputation as a lawyer to get out of spending time in jail, because she had passed away a year earlier. Carol remained in jail for 6 months, during which time the state took custody of Denise and placed her into foster care. This event led to Denise recognizing that unless she could do something about her living situation, she would have to endure living with the abuse from her mother without the protection of her grandmother. She came up with a plan to use her grades in school as a way to accomplish her goals. She went from being an average C student to becoming a straight A student while she was in foster care, hoping that her foster parents or social worker would see the improvement in her grades during her time away from Carol, and that the state would deny giving Carol custody of her when she was released from jail. But after she was released, Carol was only ordered by the courts to attend parenting classes to regain custody of her daughter. With her plan failing to succeed, Denise, still only 8 years old, came to see that getting good grades in school and going away to college was the only way she had of getting away from her mother. In the years that followed, she looked forward to the times when her mother would get caught and arrested, because then Denise would be placed into foster care, where she could finally relax without having to live with the fear of abuse from upsetting her mother. As she got older, she began to see the cycle, when, at the end or nearing the end of each month, when she'd run out of drugs and money, her mother's mood changed, and she would be at her most volatile, upset at having to wait until the beginning of the next month before she could score again. Denise learned to stay after school, mostly staying at the library, to avoid going home until the last possible moment. For these reasons, it's easy to understand why she had no illusions about her relationship with her mother. So, when she began behaving like a young girl falling in love, that she was, and talking on the phone with Gary for hours, Carol's resentment towards her was triggered. Her mistreatment of Denise then became a constant thing, no longer restricted to just the end of the month. Instead, now, throughout the entire month, month to month, both focused and intensified. Because her feelings for Gary grew, she found sanctuary thinking about their future life together. Denise was willing to withstand the abuse from her mother for want of being in a relationship with Gary. So then, when out of the blue, Gary said that he no longer wanted to talk to her, she felt as if the rug had been pulled out from beneath her feet. Her relationship with Gary had come to an end, but the intensified mistreatment from her mother was only just beginning. Confused and frustrated, she doubled down on her schoolwork in an effort to get out from underneath her mother as soon as she could. Chapter 7. Carol. Denise's mother, Carol, was an only child born to a prominent family. Her father, Jacob, was a college professor, and her mother, Kathy, was a lawyer, both of whom were highly respected in their fields and maintained high expectations for Carol as well. Jacob was the oldest son of Jack Robinson, a man born at the end of slavery, who was renowned for his stance against the injustices suffered by African American sharecroppers in the early 1930s. Because of the ongoing threats and danger to his family, he took his family and migrated to the North, where he continued to fight for his rights and justice, and eventually returned to his hometown of Jacksonville, a multimillionaire. The Robinson legacy continues as one of the most prominent African American success stories in American history. It was the expectations that were based on her prominent family history that caused Carol to rebel, feeling as if she would never be able to live up to them. Because of these feelings, Carol turned to the streets, where the expectations of her were much less difficult to achieve. Both before and during all the years of her rebelliousness, she maintained a relationship with her father, one of Daddy's girl. When Carol in the 11th grade turned up pregnant with Denise, she boldly told her parents that she was pregnant and informed them that she had already made plans to move in with Trey, the boy who had gotten her pregnant. She also told her parents of Trey's plan for them to get married and that she had every intention of having a wonderful life with him. This, and that she was madly in love with him, and he with her. Despite the displeasure and disappointment that she caused her parents because she was pregnant, Carol still received moral and a great deal of financial support from her father, not only against her mother's wishes, but also behind her back. Over the next 2 months, the young Carol enjoyed her life. She envisioned herself staying home and keeping house while Trey was supposedly out looking for a job. In reality, Trey spent his days and some nights with his college girlfriend in her dorm room. Carol's naivete had her believing that This was how she would live the rest of her life, while living the illusion of her being a mom and a homemaker, with Trey coming home to a huge kiss at the front door and a home-cooked dinner after a long, hard day of providing for his family. Unfortunately, it did not take long for the relationship to end, with Trey leaving Carol, bitter, alone, and pregnant. With Trey now gone, she found herself unemployed and unable to pay the rent or manage to take care of herself. The illusion faded, and she had to move back home with her parents. During the time that she lived at home while pregnant, a bitter Carol and her mother argued constantly. Then, during one particularly bad episode, with Kathy accusing her daughter of stealing money out of her purse, she attacked Kathy, drawing blood from a wound on her forehead. This attack on his wife by his daughter, along with the accumulated stress of their previous conflicts, caused Jacob to suffer a heart attack. With their fighting halted, both women rushed to get medical attention for the fallen man. He was unconscious when admitted into the hospital, and in the weeks that followed, never regained consciousness. After some time, the condition of his physical body began to deteriorate, and Jacob had to be placed on life support, where he stayed for the remainder of her pregnancy. And while Jacob's heart attack brought the conflicts between Carol and Kathy to an end, the conflict between Carol and the still as of yet unborn Denise began. She blamed her pregnancy and unborn child not only for the loss of Trey, but also now for the illness of her father. Chapter 8. Back in the City. Deborah, finding herself having to move back to the city, to a place that she could afford on her own now that Travis was gone, in the back of her mind was the fear that maybe it was the beginning of that old life returning. She was determined to find a job quickly, because it would prevent her from having to make a call to Sam as backup in case she and Gary once again needed his support. She kept it to herself, but years earlier when Sam stormed out of their lives, she was thrilled at not having to see him anymore, always reminding her of how far she had come, and until now, the life she never thought she would ever be going back to. The divorce decree was anonymously delivered to her new address, just a month after she and Gary moved in. It was left wedged into the crack of the front door to her apartment, the messenger reporting it as delivered to the law firm that hired him to deliver it to her hands. When she opened the front door on her way out, going to work, it fluttered, falling right in front of her face. Her reflexes took over, and she grabbed it from midair as it fell. She was feeling proud of how quickly she moved, like a ninja, she thought, smiling. But her amusement was only short-lived, as she opened the envelope and read its contents. No longer smiling, and with tears welling up in her eyes, she turned, went back inside, and slowly pushed the front door closed. In the months following their move back to the old neighborhood, Gary remained withdrawn and never went outside. Gary, now 15 years old, was still living with the pain of feeling betrayed by Denise. On top of everything else in his life that was going wrong, he dreaded the idea of having to return to school, the start of his 10th grade year finding him having to explain to everyone about why they had to move back to their old neighborhood after the divorce. That's when he made the decision to drop out of school. Deborah's new job had her leaving for work before Gary left to go to school. It was at the end of the first week after school started that she got a call at work from the school informing her that her son was not attending any of his classes. Deborah immediately informed her supervisor that she had a family emergency and left work early that Friday. She got home to find Gary playing his video game in his room. Furious now, and coupled with the stress of everything that had happened in the past few months coming out, she got into her first ever shouting match with Gary. Then, losing her temper because he was talking back, she snatched his gaming console up and threw it down, smashing it into pieces. He sat astonished. Now that she had her son's attention, she laid down the law, telling him that his behavior had better change and that he was going back to church starting Sunday. She then told him that he'd better get his act together or she was going to look into having him turned in for a psych evaluation. Deborah ended her outburst, telling Gary that he'd better return to school or she would have him placed in reform school. Gary had never seen his mother like this before, and the things that she threatened she would do had him frightened. Now, feeling backed into a corner and pushed over the limits that his young mind could handle, he made a desperate plan of escape. For the first part of his plan, he made breakfast for his mother the next morning, apologizing for his part in everything that happened between her and Travis. Then, he went to church with her on Sunday, acting like the old Gary, she thought, obedient and respectful. They spent the rest of the day Sunday playing games together and watching movies like they used to do. Gary waited until after his mother left for work the next day, and then packed a small gym bag with some clothes and ran away from home.
Chapter 9. Gary's Journey. It was late Monday night when Deborah, after waiting for Gary to return home from school, finally accepted the fact that he had run away and was no longer coming home. At first she was devastated and blamed herself, so it was just before midnight when she finally got control of herself and stopped crying. Then she called the police department to report her son missing. As she started explaining the situation to the duty officer who answered her call, she began panicking again and ended up going into many unnecessary details, including how Gary might be using the last name Smith now instead of Edwards, because now that she was divorced from his stepfather, he might be using her maiden name. The duty officer could hear how distraught she was, and rolled his eyes as he sat on the other end of the phone and just let her keep talking. Relieved when she'd finally finished, he loudly exhaled and told Deborah in an exaggerated monotone that she had to wait 24 hours from the last time she saw him before she could call in and report a person missing. That meant she had to wait until the next morning to call before the police could act on the report. "My son could be hurt or killed by then. You have to do something now," she yelled in response. "I'm sorry, but those are the rules, ma'am. They're the same for everybody," the officer replied in the same dry, uncaring, monotonous drone. Furious, Deborah hung up, now feeling even more frustrated and distraught. Helpless, she had to do something, and only knew that she would be unable to leave her apartment in the morning, fearing that she wouldn't be there in case Gary were to call or return home. She picked up her phone and called her job. She left an irrational message on the answering machine, stating that she'd quit and left her address where the job could send her last paycheck. Then again she went into details in the message about why she was unable to leave her apartment, choosing to stay home by the phone no matter how long it took for her son to call. Then, mercifully, the answering machine beeped with the time having run out, automatically disconnecting the call. Meanwhile, Gary, with no experience being on his own, stood out like a sore thumb walking the streets at that time of night, and was quickly picked up by the police. It was just 20 minutes after Deborah made the call, and after being identified, the police called back to inform her that she did not have to file a missing person report after all, that they had Gary, he was safe, and she could come pick him up at the police station. While in transit to the station with Gary, the officer witnessed a multiple-car traffic accident. He pulled over, called it in, requested an ambulance, then got out of the squad car and took charge of the scene. Gary, left alone in the car, was observed by a homeless man, one of the people in the small crowd that was forming at that time of night. He saw Gary in the back seat of the police car, but not in handcuffs. He seized the opportunity to set Gary free. He opened the door, telling him to run, allowing him to escape. Gary got out and immediately started running. Not at all familiar with where he was or where he was running to, he just kept running until he was unable to run anymore. He found himself at the end of the street looking out onto the harbor. He'd unintentionally made his way to the docks. He looked around and saw ships moored to the piers and the bustle of hundreds of longshoremen involved in the chaotic loading and unloading of cargo on one of the ships. With so many people working, Gary, who was now terrified that he was being chased by the police, made his way unnoticed onto the ship and stowed away in a cargo hold away from all the activity. There was an incredible amount of noise, but he was so tired from running that he fell asleep in his hiding spot. Gary snapped awake when he felt the ship lurch as it started moving. He immediately began to panic and regret hiding on the ship, realizing only now that he hadn't thought this through. With no idea how long he'd been asleep, no idea if it was day or night, and no idea where the ship he'd snuck onto was going, his teenage imagination took over and started getting the better of him. He began imagining that his face was surely on a wanted poster by now, hanging in post offices everywhere. He'd suddenly imagined Travis at work, eagerly willing to help the FBI, telling them everything he knew about Gary while pinning the wanted poster up on the post office wall. He then thought that somebody probably saw him running away from the police car and alerted the FBI, who were probably closing in on him right now. He started wishing the ship would speed up and carry him far away to wherever it was going, because anywhere had to be better than here, so close to a prison cell. The anxiety he was feeling continued to grow until at last his mind forced his body to shut down. Trembling with fear, he lay back and immediately fell into a deep sleep. After a few hours, the ship pulled into port, but Gary, still passed out from exhaustion, slept through it. When he did finally awake, feeling refreshed but hungry, he explored his hideout hoping, but unsuccessful in finding something to eat. But, as it turned out, he only had to wait a few hours more as the ship again pulled into port. Not knowing exactly where he was, but still feeling better off here than back home, amidst the typical flurry of activity and chaos associated with offloading cargo from a ship, Gary made his way off the ship, again unnoticed. It was daylight, though he had no idea what time it might have been. He made his way off the docks and walked around the area looking around. He was shocked to learn that he was now in Jacksonville, Florida. The initial shock that he felt wore off quickly, though, when he realized how lucky he was to at least still be in the United States. Chapter 10. The St. John's Grocery Store. Gary made his way from the busy docks and through the nearby neighborhoods, but a gnawing hunger soon forced his hand, and he was caught shoplifting food from the grocery store. Triggered by the fear of going to prison, he pleaded with the security guard to let him go, telling him a made-up story about being an orphan who stowed away on a ship to escape the orphanage where he had to endure abuse at the hands of the staff. The security guard, after hearing his story, escorted him to the office to see the owner of the grocery store. Gary repeated his story to Carl, an older African-American man who owned the store. After he finished telling his story, Carl looked at him, then, without a word, turned and left the office. In a few minutes, he returned with an elderly African-American woman. Carl told Gary to repeat his story for the woman, whose name was Thelma. After he finished, Carl and Thelma left the office, leaving him alone with Ricky, the security guard, who glared at him as they sat in silence. While he waited, Gary began to relax, feeling pleased with himself, thinking about how, because he had only intended to gain his freedom from the security guard with the spur-of-the-moment story he came up with, it was now serving another purpose as well. The old man and old lady didn't know that he was on the run, a wanted fugitive back home, much less feel the need to return him there. When Carl and Thelma returned, it was clear to Gary that his story worked, and they believed him because they came in with a tray of food and offered it to him. There was a soda and a sub sandwich from the deli in the store, but for Gary it seemed like a feast fit for a king. He was so hungry that the way he ate made everyone watching him feel embarrassed. After a minute, Carl and Thelma, unable to continue watching, left the room. When they returned a few minutes later, they brought another tray with the sandwich and another drink. They took the now empty tray and replaced it with the new one. Gary began eating again, as if he were starving. This time, they stayed. After letting him eat for a few minutes, Carl offered him a job at their store bagging groceries. A shocked and thankful Gary immediately accepted the offer, talking through a mouthful of food. After he finished eating, Carl and Thelma took down some basic information from him, then called the homeless shelter and spoke with the director. They both knew the director, Bob, personally, and told him about Gary and his situation. After they finished, they had Ricky take Gary and then sign him in at the homeless shelter. Gary would be able to live there for free for as long as he maintained a job. Gary arrived at work the next day an hour early because he had no idea how long it was going to take him to walk to the grocery store from the shelter. It ended up taking less than 10 minutes, so he was early. But every day afterward, he continued to show up an hour early in appreciation for the job and having nowhere else to go, and no one else that he knew in Jacksonville. His relationship with Carl and Thelma grew into a good one, with them seeing something in the young boy that they liked. After a while, even Ricky stopped looking at him with suspicion, and they started taking their lunches together, playing cards in the office. After having worked there for 6 months, Gary had become well liked by the regular customers, and his tips for bagging groceries routinely came out to equal more than his weekly paycheck. Over the course of the 6 months, Gary met Tony, an older friend he'd made while living at the shelter. Together, they saved the money they'd earned and moved into an apartment together. Carl and Thelma, impressed with his continued punctuality and performance at work, cautioned him about leaving the shelter and not being able to make it to work on time. He promised them that he would be at work an hour early as always, and that they had nothing to worry about. Carl and Thelma waited a week to see that Gary stayed true to his word, and then decided to tell him that they wanted to promote him from bag boy to stock clerk. They explained that the promotion came with a raise in pay, so he wouldn't be losing any money now that he would be no longer making tips, and whenever he wasn't busy, he could still bag groceries if he wanted to. The job, they told him, also came with an increase in responsibility that would help them to make the store run easier. He eagerly accepted the offer. Afterwards, however, they found when doing the paperwork for his promotion that Gary had admitted to dropping out of school and did not have a high school diploma. Carl and Thelma Robinson believed in the power of education, and it was written into their store policy. In order to be promoted to any position, the applicant needed to have a high school diploma or, at the very least, a GED. When they told him about the problem with his being promoted, Gary accepted it without complaint, and that it was okay with him. He was perfectly fine just bagging groceries. But he had misunderstood where they were coming from. They saw something special in him, something that he did not see in himself because he was so young. But they knew the value of a good worker, someone who shows up to work on time every day, will work later than scheduled to when needed, and would even come in on their day off without conditions. So they insisted
and told him that they only hired him because of the bad situation he was in at the time, but under normal circumstances, they would not have been able to hire him without a high school diploma or a GED. Now that they were aware of it, if he wished to keep working there, he was going to have to get a GED. Then, to further convince him that their intentions were sincere, they told him that they would pay any cost associated with him earning his GED diploma, and they would even adjust his work schedule to facilitate his studying to pass the exam. Presented with these conditions, Gary had no choice but to accept the offer. Chapter 11. The Tutor. A few weeks after Gary began studying for his GED, Tony, his roommate, lost his job and was unable to come up with his share of the rent for that month. This meant that Gary would have to work more hours to cover Tony's part, and there would be less time for him to study. Gary recommended that Tony come and work with him at the grocery store. The older Tony was dubious about Gary's offer, not because he didn't trust him. He just didn't think that someone as young as Gary had enough influence with his boss to be able to guarantee him a job. He wasn't aware that Carl and Thelma were as impressed as they were with Gary's performance at work and the progress he was making getting his GED. He agreed nonetheless to seek employment at the grocery store, but was skeptical that he would actually get the job. The next morning, when he came in with Gary, he only half-heartedly applied for the position and was completely surprised and at the same time gained a tremendous amount of respect for the younger Gary when Carl and Thelma readily agreed to hire him, telling him that he could start immediately, all at the suggestion from Gary. During the hiring process, it was discovered, however, that Tony also did not have a high school diploma or a GED. Carl and Thelma explained that a part of being hired to work at their grocery store involved making the promise to get a GED, and Tony readily agreed. Because of his age, being 21 years old, Carl and Thelma were mistakenly counting on Tony to help Gary pass the test to get his GED. They kept the two roommates together at work, with Gary showing Tony the ropes, and gave them the same days off so that they could study together in their free time. Because Gary was naturally intelligent, it was when they studied together that he began to realize that, although Tony was older than he was, they didn't share the same level of intelligence. Time and time again, he found himself having to explain to Tony what the study questions meant, leaving much less time for being able to answer them. After a few more study sessions together, Gary knew that Tony needed help. The next day at work, he took Carl to the side to privately explain the situation with Tony. Carl let him know that he understood the problem and agreed to get a tutor for Tony. A few days later, Thelma had a talk with Tony and gave him a phone number explaining that it was for a tutor they'd hired to help him with his studies. Following his talk with Thelma, Tony called the number and made arrangements for the tutor to come by their apartment to study. Tony, under the impression that the tutor was for both of them, shared the news with Gary. Not wanting to embarrass Tony by telling him that the tutor was for him alone, and because it wasn't his first time playing along, Gary said nothing. They both looked forward with anticipation to the day when the tutor was scheduled to arrive. But when the day came, they were disappointed. The tutor was late. It was a full hour after the tutor was supposed to have been there, hadn't called, and still hadn't arrived, that Tony and Gary finally accepted that the tutor wasn't going to show. They decided to lighten their mood and turned on their video game. Gary was anxious to prove to Tony that he'd gotten better at the game they often played together, to show him that he wouldn't beat him so easily anymore, when there was a knock at the door. Gary, frustrated, having just sat down, and now had to immediately get back up, walked over to answer the door, feeling less than hospitable. He opened the door and saw a girl his age standing there. Surprised because he was expecting the tutor to be someone older, like a teacher, he just stood at the door, looking at her. No introduction or welcoming gesture, just silence. After the silence lasted long enough to become awkward, the visitor spoke first. "I'm sorry I'm late. I'm the tutor." Just then, Tony came up and intervened, stepping in front of Gary at the door. "Hi, my name's Tony. We spoke on the phone." He stepped back, inviting her in, doing his part to make her feel welcome. A sullen and silent Gary simply turned and walked away. Because he was still under the impression that the tutor was for the both of them, Tony, surprised at Gary's behavior, called after him, "Hey, where you going? Aren't we going to study together?" Still walking away, and without turning around to answer, Gary shook his head, refusing, saying that he was going to go back to playing the game. 3 hours later, after the study session ended, he overheard Tony making arrangements with the tutor for their next meeting. He began preparing himself to appear indifferent when they came into the room. He shifted his position on the couch so that his back was to them. When they came in, talking to one another, he said nothing. Tony and the tutor looked at one another, and then Tony shrugged and escorted her to the door, saying goodbye. Before turning to walk out, the young tutor said goodbye to Gary, who didn't answer or even turn around. He just waved his hand and continued to play the game. After he closed the door behind her, Tony came over to join Gary on the couch. "What gives, man? Why are you giving her the cold shoulder? She's nice. I think y'all get along. She's smart like you. You should have talked to her." "She was late, and one thing I was taught is you can't count on people who can't be on time. You should probably ask Carl to find you another tutor," Gary said matter-of-factly. Tony had no comeback for this. He shrugged and picked up the other controller to play the game. Gary's uneasy attitude with the tutor was not only because she was late, but also because he was feeling there was something uncomfortably familiar about her that he couldn't quite put his finger on at the time.